Malawi provides a fascinating case study of sustainable development. It is an extremely poor country, often ranked to be one of the very poorest in the world. But there are some improvements that have been happening. For example, in terms of health and education, there have been some notable improvements in the last 20 years. However, in terms of many other issues related to both the developmental and environmental goals, Malawi is struggling. If you look at SDG 1, there has been some reduction in poverty, but not nearly enough. There is rising rural poverty, and this is also related to rising levels of hunger that is only worsening because of climatic shocks, droughts and floods. So both in relation to SDG 1 and SDG 2, Malawi has severe challenges. In terms of health, the health system is of course very fragile. The Malawian government depends on foreign donors for a lot of health related assistance. Getting medicines, access to medicines is a big challenge. It is expensive. It's a landlocked country. Just to import anything is a problem. And in this day and age, I'm coming to you now from Malawi. It is March 2020. The corona outbreak is happening all over the world. There still hasn't been any cases of the coronavirus in Malawi, but one of the reasons could also be that Malawi is one of those countries where it is not possible to even test. So there are all of these fears that if it ever comes here, it's just going to be a nightmare. It's going to put enormous pressure on an already fragile system and perhaps even take away all the attention that is required for primary health care. So SDGs 1, 2, 3, some success, but also many challenges. SDG 4 on education, there has been some success in terms of ensuring access to basic primary education, but secondary and higher secondary education still continues to be a challenge. School buildings don't have, the school buildings are just not built properly. There's inadequate infrastructure. Teachers are inadequately paid. Sometimes they're not posted. Teachers need training. Children need desks. The whole set of issues. There are also certain issues or challenges related to power generation. I visited 2 major hydroelectric plants recently in Malawi, and although Malawi is producing clean energy in terms of hydropower, it is not nearly enough to meet the demands, and so there are frequent power cuts, load sheddings, and most policymakers are now putting their faith on coal, which they believe is less expensive and less time consuming to build in terms of a coal-fired power plant than a hydroelectric power plant. So they feel that coal perhaps is the way to go, at least for the immediate future. So there are all kinds of interesting things going on. They believe that solar energy, for example, is not a viable alternative. It can create instability in the grid. Solar energy is just not enough or not reliable enough. There is, of course, some talk about off-grid solutions. So in terms of energy, in terms of many of the typical developmental SDGs, Malawi has achieved just some success, but there are enormous challenges ahead. In terms of SDG 10, there is, of course, growing inequality in this country. Even though economic growth has been around 4.9% in the last 10-15 years, instead of the projected 9%, that was envisioned by the so-called Vision 2020 plan to make Malawi into a medium income country, a middle income country. Those have not materialized, but there is growing inequality in the sense that you do see a growing middle class. I've been coming to this country since 2006, and I see that the Malawian middle class has certainly grown. In the service sector, in banking, in foreign aid related organizations, in the UN system, even in government, you have salaries increasing for some groups of people, creating greater distance between the poor and the lower middle class and the middle class and the rich. So you have growing income inequality, which is creating some amount of frustration. In terms of governance, there's been tremendous progress in the sense that just last month in February 2020, the Malawian Constitutional Court came up with a landmark judgment that annulled the May 2019 elections and has ordered fresh elections now that will take place in the next few months. So although Malawians have been very strongly supportive of democracy since 1994, when multi-party elections were held. Satisfaction with democracy has been decreasing. But this Constitutional Court verdict that I have written extensively about in recent weeks has just renewed this kind of hope for democracy. In terms of partnerships, SDG 17, Malawi is extremely dependent on aid. Almost 35 to 40% of its national budget is dependent on external sources. China is coming increasingly into the picture. India is also providing some assistance, but it's mainly the Western organizations, the UN, World Bank system, and Western donors that are responsible for helping the Malawian government meet some of its expenditure related to development. So for example, cash transfers, healthcare, education, all of these sectors rely extensively on foreign aid. So the way in which Malawi can generate, or the potential for Malawi to generate revenue, to increase taxation, to become more self-reliant, that is all the kind of stuff that is now being debated in the Planning Commission. There's a new national consultative process trying to ask Malawians what is it that they need and to try to chart a way forward. So there's this kind of growing conversation, but it is still unclear how exactly Malawi is going to be less reliant on foreign assistance. So the way in which partnerships will work, the extent to which the Malawian government has policy space, the extent to which the Malawian government and policymakers feel they can chart the way forward for Malawi is going to be crucial. But it is also important, of course, for foreign donors to monitor, and they feel that they have to be accountable to their own taxpayers. So they have this tendency, of course, to monitor and to point out certain deficiencies, corruption scandals, and all of this. So it is this kind of mix of Malawian assertiveness confronting donor concerns which characterizes the policy-making scene related to partnerships at the moment. So that was a very short tour of some of the issues related to specific SDGs. Malawi is a challenging environment. There is some success. Some people talk about the Malawi paradox, because despite democracy, despite foreign aid, despite a lot of talk, there hasn't been that kind of performance that was expected. So Malawi is often seen to be an underperformer. The narrative, unfortunately, has been negative. I hope, given some of the recent political events with the Constitutional Court's verdict, etc., that sustainable development will receive a boost, and that Malawians will finally be able to achieve and talk about development and create much more of a positive narrative around development, and more specifically sustainable development.